activists had high hopes for HERO, that's Houston's Equal Rights Ordinance, which came up for a vote this month in Houston, but to the disappointment of many, and I suppose to the exultation of others, it went down to defeat. Here to talk about that vote with us now is Eesha Pandit. She is a Houston-based writer, activist, and consultant who believes in social justice movements, the power of intersectionality, feminism, sisterhood, and collective action. And she writes for Salon.com, among other places. She joins us now to talk about the HERO Ordinance. Eesha, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, what went wrong? I mean, Houston has made some impressive advances in recent years. They elected a gay mayor there where you live, and there have been high hopes for HERO. What happened?
Well, it was a perfect storm in Houston. The opponent of the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance were just really well mobilized from the very beginning. So the story of HERO is a few years longer than the vote that happened a few weeks ago in Houston. It actually was a city ordinance that was introduced and fought for a couple of years and passed through the Houston City Council. And then, of course, was challenged by opponents. And they tried their darndest to gather enough petition signatures to repeal HERO, and they couldn't manage to gather enough valid signatures. In fact, the story of that is another tale of the lengths to which the opponents went to try to repeal HERO. Regardless, the courts decided that HERO would have to either be pulled altogether or come up for a ballot initiative vote in this past November election. And so that's, mobilization against HERO started strong and fast from the very beginning, and came from both inside and also outside of Houston. I remember going to the city council to testify on behalf of HERO myself, and saw the buses coming in from around Texas of opponents to HERO. And so that made it very clear to me that this was a full-scale operation being launched against the Equal Rights Ordinance.
So, and the understanding I have, and I think a lot of people have, is that there was a very strong evangelical mobilization against this, Texas Pastor Council and some other folks. And I guess what a lot of people also, to the extent that this was noticed nationwide, it was for the idea that an ordinance that was about equal rights somehow in the public mind became an ordinance about essentially men using women's bathrooms. Was this just very smart, shrewd packaging on the part of HERO's opponents to use a scare tactic that will allow big scary men into women and girls' bathrooms?
Absolutely. It was just nothing but a scare tactic. And unfortunately for Houston, that scare tactic landed on a couple of points of vulnerability within sort of the broader LGBT movement. As we've had these victories for marriage equality around the country, there has been a demystification of lesbian, gay, bisexual people and what their lives are like. For the transgender community, there has not been a similar demystification. The transphobia runs rampant, both outside of the world of LGBT movement organizing, but also within it. This is sort of a rift within mainstream LGBT organizing, and trans folks and their particular concerns are often marginalized. So by focusing on the idea that there would be men in women's bathrooms, it's sort of an inherently transphobic argument that trans women aren't women. And just to set the record straight, there are many cities around the country and 18 states where equal rights ordinances exist, and there has not been one instance in which a trans woman has assaulted anybody in a restroom ever. So it's completely unfounded, but that, of course, is the point. The point was to create a rift within the movement and to leverage that rift to, you know, focus in on this one element of the story. Because ultimately, if you look at hero legislation, and in the year between the passage of the city council ordinance and the vote, predominantly the cases that came before the city council were having to do with racial discrimination and gender discrimination. 56% of the cases during that year were about racial discrimination. 17% were based on gender and pregnancy, with 4% of the cases brought to the Houston City Council having to do with sexual orientation. So this was so that was one piece of it, sort of capitalizing on transphobia and the mythology of who trans people are, who trans women are. And, you know, the opponents did that effectively. And then the campaign, as I reported, did not counter that effectively enough.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
Eesha, Pandit. First of all, as one trans man in Houston effectively illustrated with a photograph, I mean that this really quite trivial issue of bathrooms in the real world, it would actually have the opposite effect, in that someone who identifies as a man, who appears as a man, would actually be required to use the woman's bathroom, which conceivably would make women more uncomfortable, if anything. But really, that whole issue is a distraction. The whole notion of discomfort and so on. So if it was a transphobic strategy to shoot down the ordinance, did the failure come because the LGBT community was more prepared to defend lesbian, gay, and bisexual populations than they were prepared to defend a trans population? Is that kind of where they got caught off guard?
A little bit, I think that's part of it, and I think the other part of it is that the organizers of the Houston, the campaign Work in Houston, the Houston Unites campaign, focused in on countering the transphobic, message that, women should be afraid in restrooms. Now, there's two pieces of this where this sort of falls apart. In fact, the ordinance provides protection based on gender. And if those people who were opposing the ordinance, because of their fear for women's safety, one question that a lot of, women's rights organizers in Texas have been asking is, well, where were these communities when there was a backlog of rape kits that had not been texted? This was a huge scandal a few years ago in which this was, the city was not testing these rape kits. Now, if we're talking about safety and violence against women, this is exactly the kind of thing that those communities should have been paying attention to. So, that's one piece, sort of just to put a fine point on how disingenuous the strategy was. The other piece is that trans folks are not well understood. Transgender identity is not well understood. And that makes it particularly vulnerable for such demonization. And the job of the campaign then becomes to do this. It's a tough job to do, but it's something we've been working on in Houston for a while, in terms of how do you respond to this transphobic art without giving it further credence.
So
and
there are
one strategy,
is just
Sure.
To let me jump in for a second. So there are a couple dimensions that you've already identified, Eesha, Pandit, to this issue. One is the notion that the fear and then the idea of, I actually heard a politician say he was defending Texas womanhood. It sounded like something out of the 19th century, right? But the notion of the sort of inherent contradiction or hypocrisy in their position, that they're not that concerned about rape prevention and so on, that always to me suggests that it may have been disingenuous, but it was successful. So it suggests to me that maybe, and this is sort of something to reflect on, it's not in your piece, but maybe they were tapping into some more deeply seated fears and discontentment that, with the economic situation being what it is and so on, for now we're seeing about the rise of, suicides and drug and alcohol deaths among white Americans and all those things, that maybe they're preying on the deep-seated fears of people who feel their way of life is disappearing, and they victimized, they scapegoated trans people in order to prey on this like unnamed fears. And could that have been part of why they were successful with this strategy?
Absolutely think so. I mean, I think, one of the things that comes to the fore and you see a campaign like this run is you really see the weak spots in progressive organizing. And one of those weak spots, particularly in the organizing in Houston, was being able to counter with a broad narrative to say, actually, if you really want to know what this ordinance does, it protects people of color. It protects on the basis of disability. It's an equal rights ordinance that would make it so much easier for so many, vulnerable groups in Houston to get protection. Instead, we sort of wound up ceding the ground or ceding the center of the debate to the question of, are trans women dangerous? And then, it's like you've lost before you've started if you've already conceded that ground. And also, not for nothing, there are a lot of very powerful trans women activists in Houston who told me when I spoke to them about what happened in this campaign, that they weren't really allowed to speak for themselves. So in some ways, the advocacy to counter the transphobic narrative didn't actually get above its own transphobia, which is to allow trans people in the ads, to allow Houston to know who trans people are. There's only a couple ways around this. Either you change the conversation or you win the conversation that you're having, and neither of those things happen in Houston.
So is it possible, Eesha, Pandit, that part of the problem here was that this campaign brought forward a kind of a split or a power split between, as you put it, the LGBT part of LGBT and the T part?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's a long-standing split, and so one campaign maybe couldn't have fixed all of that, but it could have gotten us to a further point. And as I've heard from a lot of folks around the country, that this is, in post-marriage world, the post-legalization of gay marriage world, equal rights ordinance are the next frontier for LGBT organizing. And if they cannot get a handle on how to deal with and heal this rift, we'll see the playbooks, of the opposition come from Houston, because it was so effective here. So there's a lot at stake for really getting this right and understanding what went wrong. But there's one other thing that I think really was at play here, and that was the sort of discomfort or unwillingness to get into a conversation about racial discrimination. That's something that an equal rights ordinance would have protected against, and of course, like I said, that's more than half of the cases brought forth under the protections of the Equal Rights Ordinance were about racial discrimination. And the campaign that ran in Houston didn't really leverage that. I mean, Houston is a very diverse city. It's the most diverse city in the country. So that was a real missed opportunity. And, to my mind, that has to do with the leadership of the campaign in Houston, the leadership of mainstream LGBT organizing. And so this is another place where, and we're in the middle of a broad national conversation about racial justice right now. So to miss that opportunity, is another place where this entire conversation could have been changed.
So there was a whole intersectionality, to use that word again, a whole intersectionality dimension of this that was left unused. Or untapped in all of this. I keep coming back to this question, which may or may not be central to the debate, but it's really on my mind, Eesha Pandit. So I'm going to ask it, which is, whatever we may not admire or appreciate what the opponents of this ordinance did, but how did they get so smart? I mean, they were actually very shrewd in what they did and very effective. It's almost like in reading about it, I was caught off guard by how they came up with this and executed it so well. Am I wrong to be like sort of darkly impressed by what they did?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a really dark, but yeah, but it is, I think, important to pay attention to. And
Yeah.
I actually think that this question is really the question is what did they do? What did they leverage? So one thing is, of course, they leveraged transphobia. That's really was where they started, where the bread and butter of the opposition was in people not understanding transgender identity. So, that's one thing that really was. But the other is they co-opted the language of the women's movement in talking about protecting women and women's safety, and did it in a very twisted way, to demonize trans women. And so that's another strategic move that was very effective. And as I'm sure you know, Houston and Texas in general has been the site of a conversation about women's reproductive health and rights. And so there is a lot in the air in Texas about women's health and women's safety, and they just capitalized on that in the worst way possible.
Well, it will be very interesting to see what happens next. I'm sure there will be another go at this, and we've learned a lot from it. We've learned a lot from your coverage of it. So, Eesha Pandit, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.